All right, bear with me here. It started presenting at the beginning.
While Dean's getting that set up, I just want to tell everyone, you may have noticed in our scrolling slides that we're going before this, that Gateway Greening is launching a new Backyard Gardener program. It's a series of 9 virtual classes, and it will begin in January of 2021. So if you are interested in learning more about that or registering, I'm going to drop the registration link in the chat. And you can find out more about that there, or we'll be posting about that more soon. Take it away, Dean.
Great, thank you. All right, so today we will be talking about designing your garden / orchard / backyard, kind of all in one. And so hopefully that's what you were expecting. So first, I like to just kind of define what is a healthy backyard and orchard and garden, you know, kind of all the same, talking about all the same thing here. So kind of how I would define that would be a peaceful place that produces beauty and plentiful, nutritious food. It includes healthy soil and plants, minimal pest and disease pressure when possible, and is a functional ecosystem in and of itself. So it's more life than just you and your plants, like that there's, you know, insects and other wildlife kind of going on as well as like, you know, beneficial microorganisms in the soil and on the plants and in the air. Kind of all that together makes an ecosystem. So part of that, so what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about how, you know, oftentimes when people talk about planning their garden or planning their orchard or planning their, you know, backyard area, they're spoken of as like there's, you know, separate areas. There's the vegetable garden over here, there's the orchard here, there's the, you know, ornamental flowering things over there, and that's not necessarily necessary, and it's not necessarily the best way to do that. So first, you know, why do we separate, or why should you separate your vegetable garden and kind of your fruiting trees, shrubs, vines? And really theoretically, there is no reason to separate them. Some even grow better or great together. There's this whole concept called over yielding, where there's increasing research on like growing, you know, 2 or more crops together. You can actually get more food per square foot. Oftentimes, not with all plants and all combinations, but a lot of times that's the case. And there are many places in the world where that's the norm. You know, the vision that we have of agriculture of, you know, big giant blocks of all the same crop, that is not the standard in the world necessarily. Most of the world's food is produced by smallholder farms globally. And those don't look like an Iowa cornfield. You know, they are usually very diverse, very highly integrated systems. So they don't need to be separate. And this is a picture even of people doing that more even in the United States. So this is I believe it's an apple orchard. That, you know, while the apples are young, they're still growing wheat in between the trees, because why not? It's a way to kind of double up on your yield. So then why separate your ornamental and your edible crops? Again, there is no reason to separate them. Oftentimes they were kind of viewed as separate because it was a status symbol. It was a cultural thing that people did in terms of being like, you know, look at how rich I am. I can spend my time growing things that I don't need to stay alive. And that's part of the reason why, you know, some areas have rules that you can't grow food, is they were backdoor ways to say, if you're poor, you're not welcome here. If you need to grow your own food, we don't want you. And so like that kind of distinction is really pretty arbitrary. And there is no reason to say that a plant must be an edible or an ornamental. There are many edible plants that are beautiful. And there are more than a few plants that we consider ornamentals here in the States that are edible, and in fact are crops in other parts of the world. Things like daylilies and hostas and cannas and dahlias were all originally domesticated as food crops and are all still grown as food crops in at least some part of the world. Dandelions even are cultivated commercially in France. You know, these distinctions a lot of times are just cultural constructs. They're not actually realities of the plant. There are for sure plants that are not edible, but oftentimes that kind of distinction we make of saying this is an ornamental and this is an edible is not, it's a much more gray boundary than we like to distinguish. And again, and if you move them together like this, they can be really pretty. Like this is, you can see these little labels here pointing out like edible plants, fruit trees, serviceberry bushes, rose bushes, which are actually produce little edible fruits, Swiss chard, tomatoes, carrots, turnips. But if you look at this, it doesn't look like a vegetable garden. It just looks like a pretty backyard. So you don't have to separate those things. So then why shouldn't you separate? Why would you want to mix them together? So one, like we just saw in the last picture, it can be prettier than just having, some raised bed wooden boxes that are empty, 8 months out of the year, or 4 to 8 months out of the year, depending on what you're growing, just looking kind of empty and sad. It can be prettier to kind of integrate things together. You can actually have fewer pests when you're kind of intermixing flowering things, things with fragrances, things that are attracting beneficial insects, pollinators. You can actually have fewer pests on your food crops in some situations, and you can increase your space in a sense. So if you're looking at your garden or your yard or your wherever you're growing things, and you're thinking, well, this area over here is all of my flowers, and this area over here is where my orchard is, so I've got this area to do vegetables in. Like that's a limited amount of space compared to the total amount of space that you have. Whereas if you're thinking, oh, I can stick a tomato over there, in the flowers, or I can stick some Swiss chard there, and it's going to be pretty next to my shrubs or whatever. Like you can increase the amount of total space that is producing food for you. So lots of reasons to potentially integrate them. So then if you're actually designing your space, thinking about that you can integrate these things, that they can be grown together, you need to figure out, where's it going to go? So the first thing to do, as I'm a map guy, so the first thing that I always say to do that I think is really helpful is to make a map of the space, including all permanent features. So your map can be as sophisticated or as low tech as you want. You can just sketch it on a piece of paper, not to scale, or you can get fancy software and make sure that everything's to scale, or you can just go to Google Earth and zoom in as far as it'll let you, and have like a to scale kind of picture of your yard, of your space, and use that. And on that map, you should include things that are not going away, things that are permanent features. So things like your house, your driveway, any sidewalks you might have, any outbuildings. So if you have like a detached garage or a shed or a chicken coop or whatever you got, fences, and then also any established trees or plants that are not going to be removed. So if you've got a bunch of big trees and shrubs, all of it, like put those on the map unless you're planning on getting rid of them. And then it's also good to have above and below ground utilities. Above ground can really be helpful in terms of when you're messing with your map in terms of what you want to be growing. It's good to know like where are the wires, so that you're not going to plant something that's going to run into the wires and then it's going to get destroyed by Ameren. And having below ground can be good because you don't want to dig and hit a wire. Also, depending on the type of utility, if you have a septic system or something like that, you don't want to be planting trees too close to that could damage the septic system. All the different things that can happen with utilities. So you want to mark that on there. So above ground is usually pretty easy to do if you don't know where your below ground utilities are. It's good to have those marked and then get a map made of that so that you have that the next time you want to know where the utilities are. And just sketch that all on a map. And it can be, like I said, as simple as this. As sophisticated as you want to make it. And then the next step is you want to think about and map the permanent features that are not currently there, but that you are wanting to add at some point. So that project that you've always been like, oh, in the backyard, one day we're gonna build a patio, or one day we're gonna, get that shed back there. Put that on the map, because although you might not have done it yet, if you ever want to do it, you don't want a tree there. So put those on the map. Think seriously about like do we want a patio? Do we need sidewalks? Do we need, whatever it is, a swing set, whatever it is that you think you need in that space, that you want in that space, and put that on the map too. Play around with kind of where they would go, where they would make the most sense for you. Kind of like how you move around the space. So, if you have a detached garage, a sidewalk from your back porch to the garage is probably a logical kind of route. But, where do you see yourself moving in the space? And kind of those lines that you're pretty consistently moving about, those you should mark on as walking paths. Even if you're not going to like pour concrete or anything, like it doesn't need to be like a formal sidewalk, but if there's like a path that you're using, put that on there. If that's something that you're going to continue to want to use, you don't want to be planting a hedge right there. And it can, include other things like seating areas, like if you want to put a patio on, or you want to build a deck, or you just want a nice picnic table or somewhere to sit, things like pergolas, also lawn areas. So, when you're thinking about gardening, a lot of times us gardeners get carried away and we're like, oh, we're going to garden everything. But lawns are nice in some situations. It's nice if you have, a dog to have somewhere where the dog can go to the bathroom that isn't on your plants. If you have kids, it's nice to have somewhere where they can run around, or just for you to run around or hang out or just walk around on the grass or lay down in the grass or set up lawn chairs if you have, a big group of people over or something. And so think about, where you want lawn, and then mark that too. And then after you do that, pretty much everything that's left is a potential planting bed. It just kind of depends on, how much planting area do you want? And then, what plants will fit. So, this might make sense as a planting bed, but again, if you've got a big overhead wire that goes through here, this, big tree might not fit. So, if you kind of put all those permanent features in, it kind of, by process of elimination, makes it a little less overwhelming in terms of figuring out like where should I put this? Because you've just gotten rid of a bunch of space. So doing all of that can be really helpful. And then on that same map, usually you can do different layers if you want to get real into mapping. But it's good to, at least in a basic way, to mark soil conditions. So, if you have an area of your yard where when you have a big storm, it gets really soggy or wet, or there's like standing water, it's good to mark that. If you have areas that are really rocky, like an area that used to be, like a parking strip, where it's really compacted, or there used to be gravel there from an old, driveway or old alley or something like that, it's good to mark those things, because those different soil conditions are going to help steer you towards what can and cannot work there. So, if you have an area that pools water, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be able to grow a cherry tree. It's just not going to work. It's just not worth your time. It's not worth your effort. And you can look at that as, oh, what a bummer, I can't grow a cherry tree. Or you could look like, hey, my decisions were just made easier about what I can grow there. So as long as you kind of mark those things, it can then help guide you toward what would make the most sense in those spaces in terms of your soil conditions. And we'll talk about plants that kind of work in different soil conditions later on. It's also good to add topography. So, in small yards, this isn't usually a thing, but if you've got a bigger space, or if you're, if you're listening and you're, at a school or a church or something like that, where there's a larger space potentially to work with, there's probably more topography, but it's good to mark things like slopes. So, just like, I guess, how steep the slope is, kind of where the slope starts, where it, kind of where it ends. Any uneven surfaces. So if you've got, an area that's got a bunch of like dips in it, or like weird kind of shapes to the land, where it's not flat, it's good to mark those things, because again, those can help kind of gear you towards what is going to work there. So, if you've got a slope, it's probably not going to be a good idea to do a vegetable garden there. It's a lot harder. You're going to have to deal with more soil erosion. It's just not a great spot for it. But slopes are perfect places for trees, for fruit trees, ornamental trees. And so again, marking those things can help guide you toward, what's going to work in your different spaces. And then shade. And this is one that, is a little harder to do, or at least it's going to take a little bit more time, a little bit more observation. But you want to add shade. So it's good to draw on the map where shade falls on your property, And then for like what part of the day or how long, and again, this doesn't have to be real specific, but if you kind of draw on there, this side of my house is shaded until noon, and this part on this side of the house is shaded after noon. Then that again can kind of help let you know what will grow there, what won't. Believe it or not, there's actually fruiting shrubs that their preferred place is an area that gets morning sun and afternoon shade. So if you're kind of marking that, like, oh, this is an area that is full sun in the morning, but by afternoon it gets shade, that tells you that's a perfect place for those plants. So drawing on that shade, kind of showing kind of the size, how long it's shaded, things like that can be really helpful, again, toward gearing you to making good decisions on what plants will grow well there. So then you have your base map. So like we said, once you've kind of got all of this on there, that is really going to help guide you to make the best decisions, hopefully, in terms of what is going to grow where. You've already, kind of thought about like infrastructure wise, how do you need to move through the space, marking paths. So that's also going to be very helpful. Where is there shade, which can help you decide even, like where you want a seating area. So, this can also be like a process that kind of goes back and forth. You don't need to go just in that direction. If you decided where your seating area is, and then you look at your shade that you determined later and decide that, the seating area should be somewhere else, then change it. That's the beauty of a map, instead of just doing it in physical space and then having to, mess up a bunch of work. On paper, you just erase it and you do it again until you get something that you like. And then you're going to use this map, this base map, to then kind of play around with planting systems, kind of moving stuff around, figuring out what works where, to get your garden, your space looking the way you want it to. Yep, there we go. Sorry, computer froze there for a minute. Yeah. All right. So then you're gonna start planting. So this point too can be overwhelming for some people, especially if you have a small space. People can get worked up in terms of like, oh, there's not enough space for me to plant everything I want, or just like really overwhelmed about, oh, I can't grow that because I need a pollinator or whatever, and that's totally understandable. And so what we have found works really well to kind of help with that is, or at least what I like to do, what I like to tell people, is make a list of all the plants that you are excited about growing, like just all of them that you can think about, and include in that list if it needs a pollinator or not. And you can look that up usually pretty easily. Most things will let you know. For vegetables and stuff, that's not really a thing. Most of those you're going to be planting more than one anyways. But for a tree or a shrub or a vine or something like that, like for an apple, for instance, you need at least 2 apples. For a peach, you're fine with just 1. So you kind of mark that on there, because that can help. Again, can kind of help you make decisions. If you only got space for 1 tree, well then an apple isn't for you. And then from that list, kind of prioritize them. What are the ones that you like absolutely want to make sure you have, and then what are kind of some second tier ones, and then what are the ones that you're like, yeah, I guess it'd be fine if I didn't have those. And then on that base map, start to kind of place things around the map, starting with the ones that are at your highest priority list, and see how much you can fit. And again, that kind of having that list of whether it needs a pollinator or not can help you, because as you're going through this, you might have ones that you're like, oh, these are a must-have. But then if you realize, well, this one needs 3 for pollination, which isn't very common, but there are some things. This needs 3 for pollination, which means that I could only have this one, or if I got rid of them, I could maybe do a peach, a plum, and a tart cherry. And having all 3 of those is more valuable to me than having just the one. And you can kind of just play around with that, and as you're doing it, your kind of priorities might shift a little bit as you're looking at it. And while you're selecting those plants, as you're kind of planning your space, I always recommend that you want to plan from the top down. So if you've got things that you want that are trees, if you want an apple, if you want a pecan, if you want these larger trees, you want to kind of place those on your map in your space first, because those are the ones that are going to have effects on the things below them. You know, if you plant your vegetable garden and then you stick a pecan right next to the vegetable garden so it shades the vegetable garden, you're not going to have a vegetable garden in 10 years. It's just going to be too shady. And so plan from kind of the top down, you know, start with those big trees that you absolutely want, and then, you know, move down and kind of plan your space for kind of mid-level trees, you know, kind of those like shorter, like kind of orchard type trees. And then start working with, you know, like placing any shrubs that you know you want to have, and then work on, you know, kind of vegetable garden, herbaceous kind of ground level stuff. And doing that will help you kind of determine, you know, what's going to fit where. Because if you know, plant an apple and then you know, and then that casts shade, that doesn't mean you can't plant anything under it. It means you need to plant things underneath it that can take shade. And there are things that can take shade. And so doing that is just going to help you in your planning to start kind of from the top down. And, you know, if you're all about like, oh my gosh, I want a whole bunch of trees, and you put in all the trees that are your top priority and you realize that it took up all the space, and so you don't have any sun for a vegetable garden, but you really want a vegetable garden, well, that tells you right there, then you need to go back and you need to kind of reprioritize and move around some of the trees and figure that out. And you want to plan for mature size, especially if you like, you know, nicely formed trees. So this is just an example here of where these two trees were planted just a little bit too close together. And you can see we're at the base of this pine or this spruce tree. I think it's a spruce. It's got, you know, that classic kind of Christmas tree shape. And then on this side, it keeps that. But on this side here on the left, because this tree was too close to it, it got this weird little shape, which isn't the end of the world. The tree doesn't care. But if that's, you know, an unappealing look to you, you want to make sure that doesn't happen. So you want to make sure you figure out kind of how wide the trees are going to be, and then space the trees that far apart at least. It's also, especially for like fruit or nut producing trees, you actually get more fruit if you have sun on all sides than if you pack more trees in and they're smashed together, which I wish I had a good graphic of, but I don't. But trust me, it's true. There's all sorts of studies that they've done on it. So having that full space, even if you think, oh, I could get more food because I could pack it in, you can potentially get more diversity because you could plant more individual trees or plants or shrubs or whatever. But you're not necessarily going to get more total pounds of food. So again, it kind of depends on your priorities for your space. So then the actual layout, and we've talked about some of this already. But, you know, integrate, don't segregate different types of plants for a more natural landscape look. Again, if you're kind of mixing those together, it just makes the space look a little bit more like a normal kind of landscape space. So like this, you know, this yard here, you know, has lots of ornamentals in it, but there are also edible plants. But again, looking at this, you wouldn't think like, oh, this is a vegetable garden or this is an orchard. But if you look at this space, these two trees back here on the left, those are both apple trees. And then like this bed up here, these are strawberries. I can't remember, the color's kind of weird on my screen here, but I think there's maybe a blueberry bush or something snuck in somewhere. And I think some of these kind of smaller things are like herbs. And so, you know, kind of if you mix those things together, it makes it look more like people expect a yard to look, but you're still getting food, you're still getting your ornamentals, you're getting all of that in there. And also mix your annuals in with the perennials. And this can definitely make the yard look more, your end garden look more interesting, especially in the winter. You know, when all of your annual plants are in raised beds that are empty in the winter, those raised beds look real sad, which again is not a problem if you don't mind that. But if you have them more scattered throughout, you know, if in this spot you had like a little Swiss chard plant or something, and you had, you know, something else over here, when those are ripped out, it doesn't look like there's necessarily things missing. And so you get kind of more of that year-round interest for your space. And again, and like we talked about earlier, you know, mixing them together also has benefits in terms of, you know, pest disease management, all those different things. So you get, you know, kind of that more classic look, and you get hopefully easier to grow food too. And then mix things together of different levels. So like we talked about, you know, you start with like big trees and then small trees. So those, again, those don't necessarily have to be like totally separate. You don't need a big tree that the canopy's here and then the shrub can't start until, it goes here. On the south side of the tree, stick a shrub in there. It's still going to get actually quite a bit of sun if it's on that south side. Or if it's a shrub like a currant or a gooseberry that actually or a honeyberry that actually likes afternoon shade. I actually plant those usually on the northeast side of trees, which is where almost nothing likes to grow. But those like to grow there because they get kind of the most shade in the afternoon, but they still get some pretty intense morning sun, which they like. And then there's, of course, all the shade ornamentals out there that do great in those settings. And so, mix those together and kind of add that layer. And it, again, creates kind of more interest in the space. It looks more natural. It looks more like, a forest or something like that, but that it's maintained. Like, so it doesn't look necessarily like the straight rows of just one thing that you see in an orchard. And then if you have things like vines that you're wanting to grow, have them grow up structures instead of just a trellis. I mean, trellises are great. I build trellises all the time. But, if you're trying to like pack stuff in, if you're trying to get it in your yard, kind of integrate things, have them grow along a fence or grow over, a pergola or an arbor or, kind of like you can have like an arched walkway or something like that. You can kind of mix those features together. And then, like we've been talking about the whole time, you can mix edibles with ornamentals. So these are always the important, exceptions to the rules. So when shouldn't they be mixed? So a couple of situations. One would be soil contamination. So if you have soil contamination, or if you suspect that you have soil contamination, you want to get a soil test in that case, so that you know if you have soil contamination and how bad it is. Because soil contamination is not just it's contaminated or it's not. Like there's levels of contamination. There's different types of contaminants, and those different types of contaminants. If the contamination is relatively minimal, or if it's of specific compounds that are the contaminant, you could still potentially grow quite a bit of stuff. It just depends on those levels and what type of contaminant it is. So, for example, a lot of the gardens and orchards that we work with here in St. Louis City, the soils that they're working with have lead contamination from leaded gasoline, from lead paint that's flaked off houses over 100 years or more, and that gets in the soil and it doesn't go anywhere because nothing likes lead. Plants don't like lead. Plants don't want to absorb lead for the most part, and so once it's in the soil, it's pretty much there forever. But again, most of these gardens we work with, although they do have lead contamination, the lead is low enough in most of these sites that there's still actually, according to studies and according to Missouri Extension, it's still actually safe to grow vegetables, fruits, and nuts in that soil. But there's different kind of levels of danger. So like leafy greens are the things that are the most likely to absorb contaminants from the soil. So if your soil is contaminated, leafy greens might be harder to do. Fruiting kind of vegetables are kind of the ones that absorb it at the next highest level. Fruits and nuts, the soil needs to be pretty dang contaminated for it to get into fruits and nuts at a level that it's unsafe. And so, if you have soil and you're like, oh my gosh, I have lead, it's the end of the world, I can't grow anything. You can look and really, probably, again, it's good to have a soil test, but probably unless like you were a lead smelting factory or somebody that was just throwing lead out back, you probably would still be safe growing fruit and nuts. Like the safe level of lead in soil for growing fruits and nuts is surprisingly high, because the fruiting bodies of plants is just not where plants put lead. The fruit is the package for the baby plant. They don't want to be giving them lead. The lead is usually kind of sequestered in the leaves or the branches or things like that. They don't want to be giving lead to the baby. And so they don't. So the contamination has to be really high. So if you do have soil contamination, having raised beds with uncontaminated soil is your safest bet. And so, if that's the case and you need raised beds, it might not make the most sense to, also plant your hostas in there, because that would be very expensive to be hauling in all that soil for things that don't need it, because you're not going to be eating those things. It can also be useful to have them separate if you're wanting to grow a large amount of vegetables, specific of like single vegetables. So if you're wanting to grow things like, oh, I want to grow enough potatoes for me to eat all year, that's probably going to be hard to do if you're just sticking a plant here and there amongst your ornamentals. You're probably going to need, a designated area for that. Or sweet potatoes or things like squash and pumpkins can be hard to integrate because they like to sprawl and go everywhere. Tomatoes and peppers are really pretty easy to integrate unless you're wanting to, just plant a huge number of them. And peppers even are sold as ornamental plants. And then, and so having a separate area in full sun is really best if you're wanting to grow large amounts of those kind of vegetables that need a lot of space. Also, pets are a concern. So dogs and cats are very disease-ridden animals. There's a reason why they need so many shots. Those diseases spread to people, or quite a few of them can. And so, if you have, a dog that will just pee on all the plants outside, then you probably need to fence off where your food is, because you don't want pee on your lettuce. That's how you get salmonella and E. coli and all sorts of nasty things. And so if you have, pets that go to the bathroom outside and, aren't just going to the bathroom in the grass, but kind of go all over the place, it might make more sense from a safety standpoint to have those separated. All right, so now that you've kind of like designed the space, kind of figured out what you're going to put where, figured out kind of the layout that you have, make sure your soil is okay. The most critical thing, and we talked about this again a little bit earlier, is you really want to start with the right plant. So, the first key to building a healthy kind of orchard and garden is with a happy, healthy plant. If the plants are not happy and healthy, the whole garden is not going to be healthy, because the garden is, made up of these individual plants. And so to do that, you need to pick a good site. So that's, like we were talking about before, if you have, an area that pools water, you don't want to plant a cherry tree there. Cherry trees hate wet feet. They don't like standing water. Like, if it survives, which it probably won't, it's never going to be happy in that site. And so, if you have an area like that, you want to pick something like a pawpaw that can handle, periodic standing water if needed. Again, it doesn't love it, but it will survive just fine in those conditions. You also want to pick a well-adapted plant, especially if you're talking about ease. So, there are plants that you can find in terms of like honeyberries, which I gave as an example earlier. So they will grow here, but they're never happy here because we're really too hot. Like they're just really not for our climate, but they will grow. But if you're wanting like an easy garden, pick something that wants to grow here. Don't pick something that this is like the very edge of where it could possibly grow, because those are always going to struggle. And so picking those well-adapted plants makes your life easier. Partially because also when a plant is stressed like that, whenever it's right on the edge of what it can survive, it's stressed and it's more likely to get disease and pests. Actually, there's lots of studies on that. Same as with people. If you're stressed, it actually suppresses your immune system. You can have kind of similar things with plants. And then you want to plant it well to get it off to a good start. So this is an example of for trees. So you want to dig a nice wide hole. You want to backfill with the original soil. So there's a lot of back and forth on that argument of whether you should amend the hole or not amend the hole. What we do and what we have found is that backfilling with the original soil is good, because oftentimes especially if your soil is poor and you backfill with a lot of amendments, you've essentially just made a pot in the ground. Like the plant isn't really going to send its roots outside of that whole area because it's got a lot of nutrients right there, which in the short run would be fine. But in the long run, you want those roots to go out and stabilize the plant so that it can get big. And so that its roots aren't real close, so that when the top gets big and a little breeze comes by, it doesn't just topple over. So backfilling with that original soil, you're going to see probably slower growth for the first couple of years than you would if you backfilled it with a whole bunch of compost and manure and everything like that. But in the long term, it seems to be a better bet. If you have a fruit tree, that's grafted, which you can usually tell because it'll have this weird little shape at the bottom. You want to make sure that that is above the soil surface. You don't ever want to bury that. So it's actually, it's a wound on the plant. It's healed, but just like, if you break an arm, it heals, but it's never quite the same. It's the same with plants, and so that graft union, they call it, is always more susceptible to fungal infection, diseases, things like that. And so keeping that above the soil where it can stay nice and dry and exposed to the sun and the air, is good for the tree. You also want to stake the tree, especially if it's tall and might blow over. It's good to do that. You want to protect the trunk in winter, and you want a good carbon-rich mulch. So what I mean by that is not green things. You want woody things. So wood chips are the most common, but also like if you have leaves, like from your yard, if a bunch of leaves fell in the fall and you're raking them up, that is actually a great, like, phenomenal mulch, especially in vegetable gardens, but also around trees and stuff like that. And that carbon-rich mulch really helps do a lot of cool soil biology stuff that will help the plants grow in the long term. So also for soil improvement, soil life, and I think we have a whole class just on this, so I'm going to be kind of breezing through this. But soil life is the real key to fertility and soil quality. Having the right mix of sand, silt, and clay, and like that's what everybody's focused on in the past, and that definitely helps. Especially if your soil is dead, having the right ratio of those things is very helpful. But there's been all sorts of studies that have found even pretty low quality clay soils, if they have really good soil life in them, can still be nice friable soils. They have a nice texture to them. And so to get good soil life in your soil, there's 3 things that they need to survive long term. And so when we're talking about good soil life, we're talking, worms are the things that most people think of, and worms are definitely a part of it. But the base of kind of the food chain in the soil is bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods. They're these microscopic organisms. And those are the things that actually worms are eating. So worms, believe it or not, although they ingest organic matter, they do not eat it. They're consuming all the bacteria and the fungus growing on that organic matter. So that is really those organisms are the basis of soil life. And to keep them alive and happy and healthy, they need 3 things. Basically the 3 things that everything needs. They need food, which can come from 2 different sources. They can come from actively growing plant roots and organic matter. So organic matter would be compost or mulch, which again is why having mulch on your soil is very useful. If the garden does not have something growing in it, it should have a cover crop growing in it, or it should have mulch on it, or it should have a layer of compost added to it. If you want to keep microorganisms alive. Oxygen is another key thing. They don't want standing water. They do also need water, but they can go dormant if they don't have water. Unlike other organisms that just die, they can go dormant if they don't have water. But if there isn't oxygen, they go dormant, but also a lot of them will die. So you don't want standing water, which if the soil is full of water, it means there's nowhere for oxygen to be because all of the space is filled with water. And that's the real reason why a lot of plants actually can't survive standing water, is it's that flooding kills off the organisms that were helping the roots of that plant, and they then become susceptible to infection, and they get root rot and they die. And you also want to minimize compaction. So if your soil is really heavily compacted, you want to try and break that up. And you can do that through cover cropping. You can do that through tillage if you need to. You can do it just with a digging fork. There's lots of ways to kind of break up that compaction. But if your soil is really, really hard and compacted, it's worth it to put in the work to break up that compaction. And then to add compost, which helps with compaction, which is also adding organic matter, which is food. So you get kind of 2 for 1. And then they need to be present, which again seems pretty obvious, but they do need to be present. And the best way to add them to your soil if they're not there, which they probably aren't if you're just in like a lawn situation, is to add compost, particularly like good quality compost that you either made yourself or you purchased from kind of like a small batch supplier. So larger industrial scale composting is phenomenal. Like glad we have it. And it's a great way as a soil amendment to get organic matter in the soil to improve soil structure. But for the most part, those composts don't have much life in them because like legally they're required to make it go really hot. And that kills off a lot of the organisms. They also need to turn it a lot because they get it so hot that if they didn't turn it frequently, it would actually spontaneously combust. And so by turning it so frequently, that turning really kills off almost all the good fungus in it. So there's a lot of good bacteria in those composts, but not much fungus. So really making compost at home or getting it from like a smaller producer that is paying attention to those things. And I don't have any good ones in mind, unfortunately. But if you know someone who's making compost out there, getting it from them would be good. Oh, and this is all the stuff that I just talked about. So break up compaction if needed, like I said, so you can tell if you need to. Broad fork, so this is another tool. This is my preferred way of breaking up compaction. I really like it. It's a nifty little tool. It is a little pricey, but doesn't require a motor. You don't have to put gas in it. And it actually breaks up compaction deeper than a tiller does. So I really like it. And then cover crops, especially things like tillage radish, sorghum Sudan grass, and cereal rye are all pretty good at breaking up compaction. Adding organic matter, ways to do that are adding several inches to the surface of the soil around your plants. So that would be several inches of compost. Mulch can also add organic matter. It just takes time because the mulch needs to break down. And then cover crops are also going to be adding organic matter to your soil. And then feeding good fungus in particular. The fungus is usually what's really missing. Most places have lots of bacteria, but fungus is usually what's missing. And so that's usually where I'm going to spend more attention. But for perennials, it's particularly important. So if you're growing woodies, or perennials, especially woody perennials, things like trees, shrubs, woody vines like grapes or kiwis or things like that, they like a fungally dominated soil, which no lawn is. And so adding wood chips is a great way to kickstart fungal growth in your soil. I mean, really any mulch, but especially things like wood chips, straw, dead leaves, things that are really high in carbon, because bacteria cannot break down cellulose, which is the kind of woody material. Only fungus can do that. So if you throw that on there and there's a bunch of bacteria in the soil, they can't touch it. So the fungus that are there have a food source that only they can access. So it gives them kind of space to start proliferating. And then, like I talked about, so high quality composts is really the best way to kind of add that soil life. So maintenance, the main maintenance with your kind of garden, orchard, backyard space is going to be pretty much exactly what you think it is. If there's no significant rain, perennials should be deeply watered once a week, each week for at least the first year. So when these woody things are getting established. So if you plant an apple tree, if there's a nice rain that we have one week, you don't need to water it. But if the next week it doesn't rain, you need to water it. And it's better to do a deep watering less frequently than a shallow watering more frequently. So if you go out there with a little hose sprayer and you just kind of wet the soil surface every day, that's nowhere near as good as standing out there and really letting the water soak in, but only doing that once a week. It helps. Actually, more moisture gets into the soil that way, and also it helps push the roots to dig deeper into the soil, because the water is going to go down deeper into the soil and dry out at the top between those waterings. Whereas if you're doing a little bit of watering all the time, you're basically encouraging the roots to stay right at the soil surface, which means they're going to dry out more whenever you're not watering them. So for perennials, that's critical. And then after that first year, the more you water them, the happier they're going to be. But it's not as essential after that first year to keep watering them with that frequency. You still want to be watering them if we have a drought or a big long dry spell, but you don't need to be doing it long term. And then keep renewing your wood chip mulch. As it breaks down, add more. Just mulch is great. And then obviously weeding. Weeding is always critical. So what to grow? So the big question. So there's a lot of different options. So we like to focus on, and we recommend that people focus on those things that are climatically adapted to St. Louis, disease resistant, and have controllable pests through organic means, especially if you're interested in organic. If you don't, if you're fine using synthetic chemicals, obviously you don't need to worry about that one. But if you're wanting to do organic control, we like to, encourage people to stick the ones that are easily controlled through the organic means that are available. So if you're wanting to look at like orchard type plants, this is the sheet for you. So this is up on our website. We're also going to record this and then post it, so you can just pause this video in the future whenever you look at this. But this has all the different kind of fruit that we plant, fruit and nuts. So it's got pear, Asian pear, jujube, apple, peach, persimmon, chestnut, all those different ones. And then that list below them are the varieties that we like in particular. And again, these are varieties that we are selecting primarily for adaptation to St. Louis and disease resistance. So for apples in particular, there's like climatically pretty much any apple will grow here. But these apples are disease resistant, particularly like unusually disease resistant compared to most apples. And so these are the ones that are going to be the easiest to control disease on, especially through low spray or no spray kind of program. So, and then I always gotta mention the flip side too. So plants that do not work well here. So if you start looking at just start Googling around fruit to grow or edible plants that are pretty or good for edible landscaping or anything like that, these 4 plants will almost certainly come up: blueberry, cranberry, lingonberry, and wintergreen. And they are in fact beautiful and they are in fact delicious, but they do not like it here for the most part. They like they like soils that hold a lot of moisture, but that are free draining. So they like really high organic matter soils, but that do not have standing water or pooling water for a long time. So they do not like clay soils, which is what most of the soils around here are. And the big nail in the coffin for them is that they really like acidic soils, like 4.5 to 5.5 pH. Most soils around St. Louis have a pH of 7 to 7.5. So not even close to what they like. And then on top of that, depending on where you're at, the municipal water supply. So if you're watering them, which they really like, they like to be watered a lot. Like I recommend watering those even after the first year if you're wanting to try and grow them. They like to be watered a lot, as long as it's not pooling water. But the problem is that most municipal water supplies, most tap water, is pretty highly alkaline because it helps prevent the pipes from corroding. So in St. Louis City, for example, we have soil pH of around 7.5, and the water's pH is 9, and they want to be in 4.5, so they don't like it. So there are some areas, especially further out in the county or over on the Illinois side, where the pH is a little lower, that you can find. You can amend soils in ways if you're really dedicated to it. But if you want to do these, you really need to look into what you need to do to your soil to make them grow. If you just stick them in the ground, they're not going to be happy. They're just not. So, and I'm going to run through these real quick. So just kind of listing through some of the options, just to kind of get your mind going. So for like canopy or shade trees, if you're wanting big trees, like yard type trees that could also potentially produce some food. Chestnut, specifically the Chinese chestnut or Chinese chestnut hybrids, are the ones you want. The other types of chestnuts will pretty much all die here from a fungus that got introduced from China, which is why the Chinese one will grow fine here, because it's pretty resistant to that fungus. Pecans also make beautiful big shade trees that will produce delicious nuts. Hickory nuts, pecans are a type of hickory. Hickory trees look a lot like a pecan tree. And then black walnut are all great big tall trees if you're looking for edibles in that realm. In terms of smaller trees, so these would be trees like 20 feet or less. Most of them are like 10 to 15 feet tall. Things like apples, European pears, Asian pears, peach, pawpaw, jujube, almond, apricot, and serviceberry all work well here. Just a couple little caveats. The apricot, they do usually bloom too early. So you need one that blooms as late as possible, and then even then they might get frozen out. So usually placing them like against a south-facing wall is good. There's also some sprays that you can do that kind of like boost the frost resistance of the blooms. which is interesting if you're like real dedicated trying to do apricots. Almonds, there's really only one almond that we know for sure does well here. It's called Reliable because it's a reliable producer. But it does produce here. It's been producing in Kansas City for about 5-6 years. It's been producing here for the last couple of years. They do just fine here. Jujube is one that you probably haven't heard of, but it's this one up here. They may look kind of gross, but they're because they're kind of shriveled up, but they're a lot like a date. So they're just incredibly sweet. And so they can kind of shrivel up like that, and you can use them like a date. If you harvest them when they're still firm, they have a crunch to them like an apple. For shrubs, there's bush cherries. So if you're wanting to grow cherries, bush cherries is usually what I recommend to people for a couple of reasons. They seem to be much more resistant to Japanese beetles for some reason. Tree cherries are one of Japanese beetles' favorite foods. And the bush cherries, they hardly touch. Don't really know why, but they don't. And it's real nice. And so you don't have to fight with them. So bush cherries are really great for that. Also, bush cherry is only getting about 6 feet tall. And so they're much easier to pick cherries from than trying to pick cherries off a 15-foot tall tree. So the shrubs are really nice, and they're short enough that it's feasible to put netting over them to keep birds off of them if you're having issues with birds eating the fruit. Serviceberry is another one that's great. I think I mentioned that one in the last slide as well. So there are both kind of tree form and shrub form serviceberries. They both do well here. They produce delicious fruit, usually sometime in June. That's similar to a blueberry, but not like you're never going to be confused as to what you're eating. But it's similar in size, shape. You would use it in all the same ways as you would use a blueberry. The texture and everything is very much like a blueberry. Rugosa rose. So if you really love roses, the Rugosa roses have these real big hips on them, which what they call the fruits, they call rose hips. And those are edible. So if you really like roses, you can have your roses and eat them too. So ribes fruit. So these are things like currants, gooseberries, and josta berries. So these are small shrubs that produce kind of tart little berries. The big appeal of these is that they prefer to have shade in the afternoon. So if you have an area that has morning sun, afternoon shade, these will absolutely love that space. And they're really the only fruiting thing that likes shade. Hazelnut is another option. And again, you want to have an American hybrid version, because actually the non-American species die from a disease that is native to here. So it's kind of a reverse of an invasive species. So you want one that's hybridized with the American so that you get that disease resistant, and it does grow as a shrub. Cornelian cherry is another species. It's this picture, which is a horrible quality, unfortunately, but it gets these pretty little yellow flowers on them really early in the spring. And then they get these little fruit that taste just like tart cherries, but it's actually a species of dogwood. So it's very pest and disease resistant. Aronia berries are another native one that have really tart but incredibly nutritious fruit that are really easy to grow and have really beautiful flowers in the spring and really pretty foliage in the fall. Honeyberry is one that I talked about. Again, it's actually a type of honeysuckle, but it's not invasive. We're really kind of too hot for it, but if you plant it in a pretty shady area, they'll survive and give you some little blueberry-like fruits in the early spring. And then figs actually grow here, specifically the Chicago Hardy variety. For vines, there are grapes. So again, on that variety list are the grape varieties that we recommend. Most grape varieties are really hard to grow here. The ones on that list that we have are the ones that we have found that are easy to grow. Most of the rest just have enormous pressure from fungus, from fungal diseases in the summer that makes it almost impossible to grow them without extensive chemical usage. There's also a hardy kiwi, which you can see a picture down here. So the one in the back is like the kiwi from the grocery store, and the one up front here is the hardy kiwi, which is the type of kiwi that you can grow here. As you can see, they're not fuzzy, and they're about the size of a grape, and so you can eat them just like a grape. You just eat the whole thing. They're delicious. Maypop is another one. So it gets these absolutely gorgeous flowers on them, and then these fruit. that look kind of nasty on the inside, but it's a passion fruit. So if you like passion fruit, that's what this is. It tastes just like passion fruit, but it's hardy here. It's actually native here. You can grow hops if you're into brewing your own beer. Things like squash, melons, gourds, loofahs, all make great vining things if you want to have them trellis up things. Pole beans are also a great kind of vegetable that can grow up trellises. And then Malabar spinach, which is this picture down here on the right. It's a warm season that they've actually started selling now as an ornamental, but it's a vegetable that was domesticated in India, who knows how many thousands of years ago. And it's a great summer green. If you want kind of a green in the middle of the heat of summer, this is the plant for you. It loves the heat and humidity that we get. For things like ground covers, so you can see up in here, like in your walking paths, between stepping stones, things like strawberries can be great as a ground cover. When they're real thick like this, you're not going to get as many strawberries as if they were in nice neat rows, but you wouldn't get anything from this spot otherwise. And so if you stick it there and you just get one strawberry, that's one more strawberry than you'd get if you planted grass. And so you can still do that. Herbs are really great as ground cover. Things like mint, that's supposed to be thyme, oregano, sweet potatoes, squash, melons, gourds, and loofahs also make great ground covers. They will cover the ground, keep weeds down for you, and produce delicious food. Except for gourds and loofahs, they make cool crafts. So then for kind of some unusual areas, if you have like a rocky area, like we talked about earlier, if you have like an old parking area or something that's real rocky, there's a native prickly pear cactus, believe it or not. And it's really pretty. Like, this is a picture of it up here. It gets these really pretty yellow flowers on them. Some of them almost have kind of like an orangey flower to them as well, with kind of yellow tips, orange kind of center on them. And they stay green all winter long. After the flowers, they get these weird little red fruit. So both the fruit and the pads on here are edible, although honestly, the amount of effort you have to go to make them edible is probably not worth it. But it is technically edible. It's a cool little piece, and it is a native. If you like kind of the look of ornamental grasses, you can actually grow lemongrass. It's an annual here, so you would have to replant it every year. But by kind of midsummer, like this picture back here, you can see those big clumps of grass. That's lemongrass. Like, that's planting a little tiny lemongrass, and then kind of by mid to the end of summer, it's these big old clumps of grass. There's a fall bloom if you like crocuses. Saffron is actually a crocus. It's a fall blooming crocus, so it usually blooms in kind of mid-October here. And this is a picture of it down here. And it's these little tiny orangey red thread things that stick out. That's the saffron. So you can imagine why saffron is so expensive. But you can grow it, especially if you like crocuses. If you got an area where you want crocuses, plant these. And then if you want some saffron, you can harvest it. If you don't, you still got crocuses. And bees absolutely love them, especially because they're blooming so late when there's not a lot of food. Pollinators love those saffron crocus. If you have mulched areas, if you're doing your wood chip mulch, which hopefully you are, there's actually a type of mushroom called King Strophoria, which is what this picture is down here. It's an edible mushroom that you can purchase spawn for, they call it. It looks kind of like sawdust when you buy it, and you can sprinkle it in those wooden paths. You follow the instructions when you purchase it, and you can be growing food in your walkways. Even they'll grow just fine. If you have a pond, if you have like a big pond, or if you like, if you have like a little koi pond or something like that, there are aquatic vegetables that you can also grow. We grow in our demonstration garden water chestnuts, water lotus, arrowhead, and rice. They all do great here as long as you get good varieties. And they all produce delicious food and are also, I think, really pretty. So then annuals, I'm wrapping up here. I'll just got like 2 more slides. Really, all veggies work when you're integrating things. Greens, herbs, and the onion family are the easiest things to integrate with, especially like ornamentals or other things, because they're a little bit more shade tolerant. The onion family is more upright, so they're easier to kind of sneak in different places. Root crops will grow well around other things. and they're somewhat shade tolerant, so they can be good to kind of stick in areas. Fruiting crops are harder to grow under other things because they usually need full sun. But again, if you've got like a tree and you plant a tomato plant on the south side of the tree, it's still going to get full sun almost all day, because the sun is mostly in the southern sky because we're in the northern hemisphere. If you're looking for like integrating into ornamentals that you really want like pretty things, some of the things that are kind of the prettiest or most commonly used are things like kale, Swiss chard, nasturtium, and sweet potatoes, all of which are edible and quite pretty. And also peppers are pretty good too, especially the little hot peppers. So kind of our favorite veggies. So this is just a list of some of our like favorite ones, especially if you're looking for kind of easy to grow vegetables. We love this variety of carrots. Radishes are just really easy to grow, especially if you're new to gardening. Radishes are a great confidence boost. They grow really fast. You get a harvest really quick. They're pretty easy to grow as long as they germinate, as long as they're in a happy spot. Mustard greens, okra, Malabar spinach, all really easy to grow. This variety of baby corn, if you like baby corn, is really easy to grow. And because of when you're harvesting the corn, there's really no pests or diseases for it, which is nice. Tramontino squash and Seminole pumpkin are two squashes that we found that are really pest and disease resistant that we like. Armenian cucumber is a type of cucumber that's really disease resistant. Water chestnuts, crazy easy to grow if you have a flooded area or you have a kiddie pool that you're willing to plant stuff in. Winter radishes are also great as a fall crop. We like the Caraflex cabbage, and then we like Minuteman cauliflower, and then Chester cauliflower is an overwintering cauliflower that we really like. So that's one that you would plant like right now as a seedling, and then you harvest the cauliflower in April, which is like a full month or more ahead of a spring planted cauliflower. So especially if we have like an early summer, you'll still get cauliflower, which you don't always get from a spring planted type. Yep. All right. So this is again just wrapping up what we talked about. So for layout as you're planning your space, I encourage people to integrate, not segregate different types of plants for a more natural landscape look, unless you have a reason to want to have them separate, like we talked about earlier. Mix your annuals in with the perennials really helps, so you don't have big bare spots in the garden, have some visual interest all year round. Plant shrubs under and around larger trees, do ground covers under and around trees and shrubs, have vines grow up structures instead of just on trellises, and then mix your edibles with your ornamentals. So grow something beautiful and delicious that you also enjoy. That's a very critical thing too. Don't grow something just because it's easy to grow. If you don't want to eat it, don't grow it. And that is it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dean. So we have quite a few questions. I will try to get through as many as I can. So going back to the beginning of the presentation, someone had asked if there was a tool for measuring sunlight. I know we usually recommend just keeping an eye on your garden for a full day, but she said that she's just not able to do that. Are there any good tools that you know of?
So there are a couple apps. I'm trying to see. I have one on my phone. Let me see if I can find which one it is. There's one called like Hello Sun, like hello, comma SUN, that I've used that's free. There's a lot that are really nice that you have to pay for. But this Hello Sun is free, and it's one where you can actually change like the day of the year, and you can like kind of move your phone and it'll show you kind of where in the sky the sun would be. And so you could look at that like for today, and then you could like zoom to like the middle of winter or the middle of summer or whatever and see, kind of when you're getting sun. So then you would just look and be like, if you have your phone, you're like, oh, there's the sun, but there's a building, there's a tree. Oh, now I can see the sky. Then you would know kind of at that time, because it'll have it marked at like, 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of across the sky. So that would probably be the easiest tool that I know of if you're not able to look. But again, it doesn't need to be real sophisticated. Just if you're there on the weekend and you just take a peek, is it sunny in the morning? Is it sunny in the afternoon? Kind of thing. But that app is a nice tool if you're trying to figure out more specifics.
Okay. So also in the beginning, when you were talking about mapping out and you mentioned slope and shade, Kristen had asked if you have an example, maybe not on you now, maybe something we can send to Kristen of how you would map showing slope or shade. I know like topographical maps, you a lot of times show slope based on lines. That's probably something you could Google, but do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, so that so it and again, it doesn't need to be super sophisticated, but yeah, the like topographical lines would be the technical way of doing it. So like if you have a slope, like if your yard is flat and then it starts sloping, like as it starts sloping, you would draw lines kind of across the slope to kind of show that it's sloping. But I mean, you could also just like draw an arrow and be like, from here to here, there's a slope. Like, because you're just kind of looking at like, where is it flat? Where is it sloped? To kind of know like, oh, this area is sloped. And then you'll probably remember what you saw, like how, if it's like a total drop off, or if it's just like, just a gentle slope, to kind of tell you. But yeah, if you look up like elevation maps or topographical maps, you'll see kind of the line structure that's the more conventional way of kind of showing slopes. For shade, usually I would just again just kind of like draw a blob or something, like if it's like, oh, on this side of the house, I'd just like draw a little blob like this area, and then like draw an arrow with a little speech bubble or something, or just write in that big area like shade in the morning, or sun in the afternoon, or like under this tree over here, it's shade in the morning over here, it's shade in the afternoon over here, and I just draw that on there. Is how I would show it.
Yeah, you probably even like color code, just kind of however you want to make your legend.
Yeah.
What about recommendations for your good reading for companion planting or growing regionally? Do you have any good resources for either of those?
So I don't know of any for companion planting. Just personally, for the most part, I don't put much stock in companion planting. I mean, there are some plants that do better together than others, but often I find that has more to do with like, this one is providing shade, or this one likes it cooler, or something like that. Like not as much like, ooh, lettuce has a chemical reaction with carrots or something like that. So I just more like to think in terms of like, oh, the carrot, like most of the growth of the carrot is below ground. And so I can have carrots next to my my peppers, like which we did this year. We had carrots, and then we planted peppers in between the rows. And so then we were kind of harvesting the carrots right as the pepper plants were getting big enough. And so I usually find companion planting is more trying to sync up like when things are growing and kind of where they're growing, more so than just like a chart of this plant does better with this one does better than that. Not to say that none of that is true, but I just haven't found much luck following those recommendations. And unfortunately, a lot of that, and in terms of like growing regionally, I don't know of any like great books of like gardening in the St. Louis area, or like in this kind of general region, which is one of the reasons why we do so many classes, is because that resource doesn't exist. And so a lot of it is just trying to find other gardeners, asking them what worked, what didn't work, talking to people at the farmers market, asking farmers, what variety is this? What are, and just trying those things.
Yeah, I think you kind of covered a lot of that at the end too, after that question was asked. So sharing those varieties. What about, is it Straphoria? I'm not sure what this is. Do you know, does that grow wild here?
Ooh, that is a great question. I do not know if it grows wild here. I want to say I've heard that it does, but I don't know for sure. But I know that the King Straphoria is easily available and not very expensive to purchase, like spawn to start. And once you get it started, as long as you keep the bed mulched, it should just kind of live forever, really, just kind of indefinitely. So I would probably recommend just purchasing it unless you feel really comfortable with mushrooms.
So we are also asked about gooseberry, Indian gooseberry particularly. Do you know if that will grow well, the Indian gooseberry?
I have not heard of that. Is that like a native gooseberry maybe? I mean, gooseberries in general, the ones that we have tried, grow here. There are native gooseberries I know that do fine here. I mean, they're native; they grow just great. They all the ones I've seen really do benefit from afternoon shade, just because it's really hot for gooseberries, and they're kind of native to understory in forests. So yeah, hopefully that answers it. If
Always give it a
Indian
try.
gooseberry means something else, feel free to email us or something later.
Yeah, love to hear how it does.
Yeah.
So Jennifer asked about any go-to DIY trellis construction plans. I did mention that we use and recommend cattle panels because they are so strong and they last for many years without rusting, and you can get them fairly cheap. Not to necessarily plug gateway greening, but if you try to get them yourself, they're going to be really, really large. We have to use box trucks to pick them up from farm supply stores. If you want to get them 8 foot, we do sell them in our store, but I don't know, Dean, do you have anything else you want to add to trellis?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, definitely to emphasize that point, cattle panel are great. It's the only trellis I personally use anymore because they're just really heavy duty. I love them. But for some things, other trellises work just as well, or can also work. Bamboo is really a great material for trellising, especially if you're trellising like really viney things like pole beans or Malabar spinach. Bamboo is great for that. And bamboo is really cheap and easy to get at most hardware stores. Yeah, I mean, otherwise, I don't know of like specific plans, but I mean, really any like, like if you want to build like a pergola type trellis or something like that, like there's lots of them online, and it's just finding somebody who knows how to build or who's comfortable building stuff with wood. And then usually they can run with it. Most of the plans are not very complicated for those if you have a pretty good familiarity with construction.
So Oscar asked if there was a course for soil amending, and I did mention, I don't know if you're in our area, but if you're in our service area, our backyard gardener program will cover soil health and composting. Do we have any classes currently up on YouTube or in the works aside from the backyard gardener program that gets into that, or other resources outside of gateway greening?
I know we've taught a class in the past, but I think it might have been at our conference. So if that was the case, it wouldn't be up on our YouTube. But you could check on our YouTube. If we had one of our past classes, we would have filmed it and posted it on our YouTube channel, and you can just search for it on there. I think we are looking at teaching that class as well, but it won't be probably until like January or February that we would be teaching that. And then, yeah, in terms of amendments, I guess it would depend on kind of what specific questions or like what specifically you're interested in terms of amendments. But because yeah, for the most part, we just use compost. I mean, a lot of the other amendments are great, but compost kind of does it all for the most part, unless you have just like a really awful deficiency in something. And so yeah, I don't know of like a good comprehensive resource if you're looking for like, if I'm deficient in phosphorus, what do I add? I mean, extension agencies are usually good to reach out to. Like looking at extension agency websites would probably have some recommendations on that, but I don't know of like a comprehensive resource.
We will have a class coming up on composting in November, so you can always check our Facebook events and we update those by month. So keep an eye on that. Let's see, suggestions for squash bugs and cucumber beetles.
So cucumber beetles. So the only thing, I just saw this year and I have not used it before, but we work with, or we were partners with the Grow exhibit at the Science Center. Like we know the people who run there, and a couple of them used to work here at Gateway Greening. And so I go visit them regularly. And they had a huge cucumber beetle infestation, and they controlled them by putting out yellow plates with water in them. Like just like a little yellow disposable like plastic plate and they just put like, a ½ inch of water in the bottom, and the cucumber beetles were attracted to that color, and then they drowned. Like they had these little plates all over the place, and they were just full of dead cucumber beetles. Which is probably the simplest system that I've ever seen. I mean, hopefully it would work in other situations, but it worked for them at least. In terms of organic control for those, for cucumber beetles, really your only options are like a barrier type method. So you could put like an insect netting over the plant when they're young, like before the beetles show up, and it'll keep them from getting in there. You could also do something like a kaolin clay, which is kind of a messy process to do, but is effective. It's like a really fine clay that almost looks like you painted the plant, and they just hate that. And then there are like organic insecticides that you could use if you needed to, like as a last resort. Things like spinosad or pyrethrins are certified organic, but they are broad spectrum insecticides. So you do need to be careful with them, just like you would with any other insecticide. For squash bugs, it's a lot of the same kind of issues. So in terms of actually like killing them, it would be the same, like either exclusion methods, kaolin clay, or like spinosad or pyrethrins. But for them, I honestly find that the best way to deal with those is to plant varieties that are resistant. So like that Trombensino squash, the Seminole pumpkins aren't bothered by them as much. And then to monitor your plants on a regular basis. And it's a pain, but monitor your plants, just look. And when you see the eggs, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google, squash bug eggs, and you'll see them. I'm sure you've seen them before. They're like these little orange clusters on the bottom of the squash leaf, and just smash them. Like pinch it with your hand and just like rub your finger, and you'll squash those eggs. And if you do that pretty consistently, like when you're out in the garden, just kind of patrol the plants and you do that, usually the numbers are not going to get high enough to be a real issue, especially if you have a variety that's resistant in the first place. But yeah, those are the best controls for organic.
I have a handful, few more questions. So can you plan, you talked about different tree sizes, but can you prune them in order to keep a mature tree smaller? Is that a good idea?
You can to some extent. So depending on what type of tree, there are also different root stocks. So like apple trees, like there's apple trees that are standard size apples, which are like apple, just like a wild apple, which can get up to like 40 feet tall. And then there's semi-dwarf apples, which are just grafted onto like a different root stock, where they'll only get like 10 to 15 feet tall. And then there's full dwarf, where they'll only get like 8 feet tall. So that's your best bet, is to pick a root stock that's going to keep it around the size that you really want it. But then if that's still too big, you can then prune it to some degree. But like if you have a standard apple that wants to be 40 feet tall and you're trying to keep it 10 feet tall, it's not going to work very well. So you can prune it, but it's kind of a ratio game. Like you don't want to be trying to keep something that's real big, real tiny. But you can prune stuff to keep it smaller than it would normally want to be.
Okay, so we have 8 more questions. Do you want to take those last 8? Okay.
Sure, if you're up for it.
Yep. That should be pretty short and easy. So you had mentioned a soil rake, and I was responding to someone else at the time, and I asked if they could get a repeat on that name.
So was that for the breaking up?
It was early on, I know, because I didn't catch it.
Was it the broad fork? Is that what we're talking about?
Probably. If that's not what you're talking about, you can leave a comment in the chat. What was it called again?
Broad fork. So it's this picture
just broad. Okay.
Yeah. Just a broad fork. So it's so it's a lot like a digging fork, but it's wide enough that you can stand on the middle, and it's got the 2 handles. So you kind of step on it to push it into the ground, and then you just kind of pull it back to break up. So it's just easier on the back than trying to break up the soil with like a shovel or something like that.
Yeah, it looks like that's what they're looking for. Thank you. And then, so you also mentioned deep watering. You're asked how long to water for deep watering. My experience with that kind of depends on what you're watering, but what?
Yeah. So it definitely depends on what you're watering. But for like, if you have like a newly planted like tree or shrub, usually the number that I give is 5 gallons per week. So that would be, and usually the best way to do that, I say, is get a 5-gallon bucket, start a timer, and you like start filling it up with your hose, see how long it takes to fill it up, and then just time yourself. So that you're not like trying to fill up a 5-gallon bucket and then dump it or something. But, if it takes like 30 seconds to fill up a 5-gallon bucket, then you can just stand there with your apple tree and just count to 30, and then move to your next tree and just count to 30, and just do it that way. But yeah, for like a vegetable garden, that's harder to gauge. But it's usually just water it until the water is kind of like starting to run off, and then usually I like wait until it soaks in a little bit, and then start it again. If it starts running off, stop, let it soak in a little bit, and just do that for a little bit. And then you can kind of stick your finger into the soil too and see like, is it actually soaking in? Because if your soil quality is really bad, it's not probably going very deep, and you're just going to need to do that longer to get the moisture in there.
What about hardy varieties for all? Do we have any good hardy varieties for almond here, and also fig? I think there's some good fig trees that grow.
Yeah. So the almond. So almost all almond varieties, the tree is hardy here. The problem is that they bloom far too early and they get killed by frost. So the one almond that we know for sure does well here should be on this sheet. Yeah. So it's called Reliable. There's another one that I'm trialing called Javid's Iranian that I think is also going to do well here, but it's very hard to find. But Reliable is one that is accessible to the public, the general public, and does well here and grows really fast. For figs, the main one that we have had the most consistent luck with is I'm not seeing it on here, which is surprising. Oh yeah, no, there it is at the bottom. Is Hardy Chicago, or Chicago Hardy. So that one is kind of the most dependable one. There's lots of other ones though that have done well in certain situations, like brown turkey, Peter's honey, lots of different ones. But the Chicago Hardy is a workhorse. It does though pretty much all figs though. Their rootstocks are hardy, but the tops are not. So like even Chicago Hardy, unless we have a really mild winter, the entire top of the plant will die, but it will grow back from the rootstock and still be able to produce fruit like in the same year. So it's a shrub here. It's not a tree like it would be in the Mediterranean.
And so she asked how they can get affordable plants and seeds. And I had asked what county you are in, because if you're in our service area, well, we did just start opening up our seeds and seedlings to the public. You used to have to be in our network, but really anyone from the public can get them as long as you can. We don't ship out, so you'd have to come to our carriage house to pick them up, and we only do it during certain periods. So we'll be opening that back up in the spring. If not in our area, do you have any recommendations of good places? And if you want to drop where you're from, Shay, we can maybe give you a better answer about it. Now, Dean, if you have recommendations otherwise.
Yeah, usually the easiest way is find somewhere, like in my experience, usually the best way is find somewhere online to get it, or in person to get it. If you can find like a local nursery, get it, and then propagate it yourself. Is usually the cheapest and best way to get stuff. Because yeah, plants are expensive, but it's because they're a lot of work to grow those. It's not like they're not. There's some that are overpriced, especially in the ornamental realm, but in the food realm, for the most part, like that's just how much work it takes. But yeah, you can also check farmers markets. Some growers have started selling at farmers markets, and they're usually a little cheaper. But yeah, usually propagating them yourself is the best bet if you're wanting a lot. For smaller amounts, especially seeds, yeah, like Tanya said, if you're close to us, our seeds are absurdly cheap. And some kind of more like farm and home stores, the seeds tend to be cheaper cost-wise. But you do also want to make sure that you're getting a good quality thing. Like a cheap apple tree at a hardware store might not be worth it if that apple tree just gets disease all the time because it's a bad variety. Especially for things that are perennial, it's often worth the investment, even if it's just to get one and then propagate it yourself in the future.
Okay, so it looks like last 3 questions. Would strawberry grow around black walnut under shade? Strawberries like a lot of sun, but do you know of any?
So strawberries will grow in the shade, but they're not going to produce very much fruit. So like wild strawberries often grow in forests, but they're not very productive. as for the black walnut, I'm not sure. So actually a really good resource for that is the Missouri Botanical Gardens. They're like plant finder. Or like if you search, like usually if you just like search a plant and then like Mobot, it'll be like the first result. Oftentimes, and it has listed like height, width, soil conditions that a plant likes. And in that list is also will it tolerate black walnuts or not, which is wild. But Mobot does have that for most plants. But yeah, I'm not sure. I would not be surprised if they could tolerate it, but I don't know that they can for sure.
We were asked if kiwi and sweet potato vines overwinter in STL.
So the hardy kiwi will. The like conventional kiwi from the like that you would see at the grocery store will not overwinter here. The hardy kiwi will. It's a woody vine. You kind of grow it and treat it a lot like a grapevine. The sweet potato will not. So sweet potato is an annual here. So.
And finally, Debbie asked if you can grow almonds on a slope.
Absolutely. Yep. Pretty much all fruit trees. I mean, I can't think of one. I can't think of a fruit tree that doesn't actually like slopes. Slopes help with drainage and also airflow. It helps kind of keep air moving a little bit, which helps with disease and stuff. So yeah, pretty much any fruit or nut tree will grow just fine on a slope.
Great. It looks like that's all of our questions. Thank you everyone for joining. And again, this presentation should be on YouTube tomorrow. So if you want to go back and see all these varieties Dean mentioned, you'll have access to that.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Thanks everybody.
All right. Thanks everyone. Bye.